Yes?
Yes.
Well, as many of you noticed, the event tonight was announced for 7:30 p.m. start. Generally, for years and years, our events have started at 8 o'clock. And there's been a debate ongoing for a while. Several people have said, can you start the programs a little bit earlier? Because they break up too late and some people have to drive back to wherever, they don't live right nearby. Can you start a little bit earlier? So we relented, and we're going to try to, more consistently anyway, have programs start at 7:30. I suspect this may involve a certain amount of learning on the part of our core constituency, and we'll eventually maybe get to the point where people will arrive in time for 7:30 rather than 8 o'clock, or for that matter, 8:15 or 8:30. But anyway, it's a process, and this is the start of it. Before we get going, I have a lot of announcements to make before we get things rolling tonight, but I wanted to invite our chairman, NAASR chairman, Vahé Tachjian, to please come up and say a few words. Rafi.
Thank you, Mark. I'm not as tall as here, so I'm not going to move the mics. In addition to the earlier start time, this is also an unusual day of the week for NAASR programs to take place. We normally do it on Thursdays, but we have to comply with the speaker's availability and his schedule, so that's why you're a day ahead of normal time and a half an hour ahead of normal time too. I want to welcome you all to this gathering. We take advantage of situations where we have a speaker who's come from a long distance away and is available for a speaking engagement. I appreciate your being present here, and I welcome you all. I'm sure the topic that you will cover is going to be dear to our hearts in terms of memories that we might have concerning the genocide and how some survivors made it to safe havens. I appreciate your presence, welcome you all to this gathering, and please be responsive to the speaker and ask a lot of questions. Take care, bye-bye.
Yes, I'd forgotten that tonight is Wednesday, in fact, not Thursday. Another reason is that there is another program in Watertown tomorrow night over at ACEC, so we sought to not conflict with another event, which we try to avoid whenever we can, although I don't see him, but Father Nerses Tavukjian is here, and we're conflicting with him next week, but I'll get to that in a moment. Several announcements, and this is probably not a complete list. This is a complete list of upcoming NAASR events, but it's not a complete list of general events going on in the community, but some of them I want to mention. This Friday, April 19th, at 10:30 a.m. is the commemoration of the Armenian Genocide at the Massachusetts State House. And some of you have seen announcements circulating today that the scheduled march from the State House to the Armenian Heritage Park that had been announced has been canceled. The event has not been canceled. The program will take place in its entirety at the State House, starting at 10:30 a.m. on Friday. Next Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Here in this room, we will be having an unusual program. It is the epochal defense of Van, which is a special video presentation of a lecture originally given almost exactly 30 years ago, April 18th, 1983, by NAASR founder and Van area native Thomas Amirian, whom some of you I'm sure remember. Mr. Amirian was one of the three founders of NAASR with Manuk Young and Ara Avakian, and he gave this lecture, well not here because NAASR was not in this building at the time, but he gave the lecture I think at the old NAASR headquarters. It was videotaped, and it's kind of a unique document because Mr. Amirian, as a youngster, was at the siege of Shadak in the Van region and did considerable research into the Van defense events and gave a memorable lecture at that time, which happily was preserved for posterity, and I hope you'll come witness this revival of that program. That same evening, in far away Worcester, from which no man has returned, is another superb event at Clark University, the use and misuse of history in Turkey, the Holocaust, and the Armenian Genocide. This is a program that has been organized by our friend Father Nerses Tavukjian. At least he was our friend until this conflict arose. So now I don't know, but we do have an announcement of it, and he is here tonight. If you have any questions about that, if you choose to go to that event rather than attend ours, there will be repercussions. On May 2nd, NAASR has a program that will begin at 8 p.m. Why at 8 p.m.? Because on May 2nd, Newton Capellian, who is here, where are you, Newton? In the back, will be having a reception at the Oak Hill Studio on Trapello Road in Belmont in connection with his photography exhibition, From Sea to Soaring Summit. The reception will start at 6. You can go there and then come to the NAASR program at 8, which will be a screening of Eric Nazarian's film Bolis, and a talk will follow by the writer-director, Eric Nazarian, entitled Shattered Screens, Can Cinema Break Taboos About the Armenian Genocide? On May 9th, at 7:30 p.m., Dr. Seta Dodoyan, author of The Armenians in the Medieval Islamic World, will give a lecture entitled Armenian History Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, plus ultra, here at the NAASR Center. On May 18th, will be the 59th Annual Assembly of Members with a lecture by Christina Maranzi of Tufts entitled The Extraordinary and Endangered Outdoor Sculpture of Medieval Armenia. On May 23rd will be a lecture by Gayane Novikova on current events in Armenia, titled Forthcoming. And on May 30th, Thursday, Professor James Russell will give a lecture entitled Iranians, Armenians, Prince Igor, and the Likeness of Pushkin. That will take us through the end of May. Hope to see you at all of these programs. Some of them. Please. There is also a genocide commemoration, joint genocide commemoration this Sunday at the Armenian Library and Museum of America at what time, Susan?
At 2 o'clock.
At 2 o'clock.
At the Cambodian and the Darfur communities.
So it's a busy time of year, so thank you again for being here tonight. Regarding tonight's lecture, I need to acknowledge the generosity of our friend George Tavukjian, who is here tonight, whose financial support made Vahé Tachjian's visit to Massachusetts possible in the first place. Vahe is also going to be the keynote speaker this coming... That's for George. Vahe will be the keynote speaker at the Greater Worcester Armenian Genocide Commemoration at the Armenian Church of Our Savior Cultural Center on Sunday. So thank you, George, indeed, very much. Before I introduce our speaker tonight and we get on with the business of the evening, I think I would be remiss if we didn't, as we are commemorating the lives of those lost in the Armenian Genocide almost 100 years ago, we should take a moment and just pause for a moment in honor of those who were killed or injured in the bombing 2 days ago in Boston. So please take a moment and then we'll resume. Thank you. Our speaker tonight, Vahé Tachjian, was born in Lebanon, earned a Ph.D. in History and Civilization in Paris, and his research covers the period of the French occupation of Cilicia, Syria, and Lebanon between the two world wars, the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and refugee problems in the Middle East. He is the author of and co-author of a number of significant works in the French language, which I do not think it appropriate to embarrass myself by attempting to pronounce. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And as well as a number of important scholarly articles. most of which are not in the English language, but his forthcoming work, which he will be discussing tonight, will be in English, which is going to be very useful, at least for me. He is also the chief editor and the project director of the wonderful ushamadian.org website, and I know he would like to have the opportunity to impart some information about that tonight as well. So please welcome, wherever he is, Dr. Vahé Tachjian. Vahe.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, George, and thank you, Mark, for your hospitality today. I work today in the library, and I found really tremendous and extraordinary materials and archival materials and photos and books in this library. So you have really a treasure here, and I'm sure that these kind of materials could be very useful for our own project. You said about that, Ushamadian project, which is also a project which aim is to reconstruct the local life and local history of Armenians, of Armenian towns and cities and villages in the Ottoman Empire. So the topic of my lecture today is not about Ushamadian project, but it is also somehow related to my forthcoming book, and in a way that it is also about microhistory or local history, the importance of microhistory in Armenian studies, especially in this case in Armenian genocide studies. The book, or the forthcoming book, I hope that it will be published during this year, and thanks to a grant accorded to me from the Dolores Zohrab Foundation, I was able to translate it into English. It was translated by somebody who is also born in this region, from Jeff Krikor Bogharian, who lives now between Paris and Berlin. I'm not going to talk about the content of my forthcoming book, and I will talk more about issues of methodology that I adopted in my work, the concept of microhistory and the importance of diaries in this particular case in Armenian genocide studies. But of course, if you have questions about the content, about the story of these two diaries, who were both from the town of Aintab and who were together deported in the same area in Syria, between the region, or this environment between Hama and Salamiyya. So if you have questions, of course, I will be ready to answer them. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Excuse me. Beginning in May-June 1915, when the plan for the Armenian genocide was put into practice under the Ottoman authorities' supervision, the region of Bilad al-Sham saw an influx of tens of thousands of Armenian exiles. We do not have precise information as to how many people there were in the mass of deportees, nor do I intend to enter into the debate about numbers here. What is certain is that those who arrived in this area represented a sizable proportion of the Armenian population of Cilicia and the towns and villages to the east of it. So Aintab, Marash, and the villages surrounding. The new arrivals in the area also included human wrecks from central and western Anatolia, as well as the Armenian high plateau. Bilad al-Sham was an extensive region, roughly encompassing what is today western Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. So it's the region, Bilad al-Sham, okay, I can explain it, it's all this region. It was in this vast region of the Ottoman Empire that for more than 3 years the Armenian deportees would wage a struggle to survive. Although famine and epidemics led to massive human losses in these places, it bears emphasizing that no massacres took place here. With the end of the First World War, in autumn 1918, it rapidly became apparent to an international public that Bilad al-Sham was the region harboring the largest concentration of Armenian genocide survivors. All had witnessed a human catastrophe. Death, disease, and misery had reigned uncontested over the environment. An entire social system was in shambles here. The deportees had found themselves faced with the necessity of adapting to extreme conditions and complying with the pitiless laws of survival. My work, my forthcoming book, sets out to reconstruct these historical times in a sense. It proposes to examine a form of human existence bound up with the period in question, reconstruct the deportees' social environment with its many-sided internal relations, and study the human reactions flowing directly from the spirit of the times and the singular conditions they created. It therefore stands to reason that the main axis of my study should be the Armenian deportees' day-to-day existence, or more precisely, the day-to-day concerns imposed by the struggle for survival. In that sense, the deportees are also the main protagonists of the present work. The subject examined here is their peculiar world in which the prevailing conditions were harsh and survival had become a special art. For the same reasons, and I do not here focus on the policies implemented by the chief architects of those extreme conditions, I mean the Ottoman authorities, and in particular the Ittihad Veteraki, or Committee of Union of Progress, the party that held absolute power in the empire. Doubtless, we need to know the ruling party's political and ideological line, the unionist attitude towards the Ottoman Armenians, the way the genocidal project was carried out, and the various stages of its unfolding. These can help us, of course, to arrive at an exact understanding of the overall situation of the Armenian deportees concentrated in Bilad al-Sham and the conditions of existence that flowed from it. Nevertheless, taken alone, these factors by no means open a window on the deportees' singular world. They do not allow us to observe and study the traumatized Armenians' daily lives and comprehend their inner state of mind under these extreme conditions, or the means they mobilize to cope with the catastrophe or the unequal battle they waged against epidemics and dire poverty. None of these realities can appear straightforwardly or authentically in Ottoman state communications or reports, other Ottoman official documents, state laws, or even the unionist leaders' secret correspondence. For a minute examination at the level envisaged here, it is the deportees' personal testimony, their self-narration, that is of the greatest significance. In this perspective, Diaries will not only be one of my work's main themes, but as individuals who give an account of their own inner world will even become the most important primary sources of the work. And under catastrophic conditions, Diaries portray a collectivity whose mode of life and daily existence are, to say the very least, caught up in a process of radical change. we observe the progressive disintegration of this same collectivity's frame of reference, which had under normal conditions been a factor promoting these people's security. This disintegration is a hellish process that leads toward death. The best witness to it and its best interpreter is, I submit, the diarist. In the case of the Armenian genocide, eyewitness testimony can take the form of retrospective narration in which a survivor attempts to reconstitute his lived experience and transform it into common knowledge, whether in the guise of memoirs, correspondence, interviews, or art. When that happens, although the narrative is personal testimony with its own inherent value, it is simultaneously subject to the influence of its present, that is post-catastrophic times, and displays the traces of historical reconstruction. The language it uses is that of the personal testimony of its day, and by the same token, the way questions are framed and the dominant conceptual approach correspond to the spirit of the times. In addition to eyewitness accounts of this type, we also have texts written in these days of the catastrophe itself, diaries, letters, minutes of the meetings of public institutions, or their account books, and by writers who are incapable of prophesying their fate since they faced an uncertain future. What preoccupied them was their daily round, which survivors' memoirs do not, as a rule, emphasize to the same extent. And such phenomena may be observed in diaries in particular, in which we can find texts and narrations whose ends and logical conclusions are often unknown to their authors. And according to Philippe Lejeune, the diarists here consent to work hand in hand with an unpredictable, uncontrollable future. They offer us scraps of real life, which, while undoubtedly subject to authorial self-censorship at the moment of their transformation into text, nevertheless manifestly bear the stamp of the authenticity of the moment. To be sure, what we see is not a real-life video, yet it is a live process in which we can very well observe a gradual transformation of reigning conditions, internal shifts, and in their wake, the manifold influences to which the diarist and his entourage were subject. In my work, I am by no means inclined to reduce diaries to the role of mere ancillary documents that can provide confirmation of a historical event. Rather, diaries are here treated as fundamental primary sources, as monuments, to use Mark Neshanian's expression. As such, these works of self-narration shed their status as purely factual, archival documents and are invested with new and enduring value. And throughout this work, diaries are serving it as my basic travel companions and guides, and it is by way of diaries that I penetrate to the level of day-to-day life and expose the most minute yet simultaneously essential details. Daily diary entries show us how a family obtained its daily bread, the gradual impoverishment that deprived it of basic nourishment, the mutual assistance family members gave each other, and the limits on such assistance, the deaths of loved ones and conversions or the other moral compromises made for the sake of survival. In their daily jottings, in a word, the diarists studied here depict a process, the gradual deterioration of day-to-day existence, the culmination of which is unknown to them, although they know that they are living through a human catastrophe, that death is pitilessly mowing down their loved ones, and that they themselves are helpless in the face of it all. The diary, regarded as a primary source, acquires its full value when it proves possible to situate it in its true social and temporal context. And it is then that we can comprehend personal testimony, illuminate its various, sometimes obscure facets, bring out its contradictions, underscore the novelties it transmits, and transform seemingly insignificant details into keys for deciphering events and situations. Carlo Ginzburg might never have succeeded in recreating Menocchio's 16th century microcosm if he had not also had expert knowledge of the sects flourishing in the Friuli, this Italian region, in the medieval period. In other words, Ginzburg was closely acquainted with the times of the miller, who is his book's main protagonist, and also with the social context he lived in. This allowed him to put Menocchio back in his native habitat, illuminate the hidden recesses of his personality, and penetrate to the heart of the thoughts he expressed. I try to respect this principle in my work. My Menocchios are two diarists, Father Nerses Tavukjian and Krikor Bogharian. In the years of the deportation, both lived in the same places, Hama and Salamiyya, today neighboring towns in Syria. Just to show them on the map. Here, Hama and Salamiyya. So their self-narration focuses on just one small area in Village de Champs, throwing a spotlight on the day-to-day life of those deported here, and more generally, the environment in which their struggle for survival took place. Nevertheless, as the other sources I'm using in my study show, my investigation of the situation of the Armenian deportees then living in Village de Champs and the two localities just mentioned is part of a wider-ranging research project. And this has made it possible for me to place the Hama Salamiyya microcosm in a broader social, economic, and political framework, and to examine it in that perspective. The two diaries at the center of the present study show us a tripolar social field that emerged under extreme conditions. These two deportees waged their own struggle for existence within the boundaries of that field. The first pole is the diarist himself, with his personal preoccupations, memories of the past, uncertainty about the future, constantly fluctuating moods and moments of happiness and despondency. The second pole is his family, that immediate nucleus in which, on various levels, a spirit of cooperation prevails. It is in the same nucleus that the daily trials and tribulations of the catastrophic environment come emphatically to the fore and are depicted in their true colors. Epidemics, the lack of food, the consequences of dire poverty, the death of loved ones. And the third pole is the diarist entourage, comprising, in the present case, the other deportees in Hama Salamiyya, who in some sense constitute a prolongation of the life of his community of origin, but also the indigenous inhabitants, the local economy, the prices of basic foodstuffs, the town itself. Here, the diarist is most likely to record impressions of his environment. He portrays his compatriots' mode of life, as well as their efforts to adapt to local conditions and engage in remunerative economic activity, describes the reigning poverty, the unburied bodies, and the many different facets of the deportees' relation and decline. In a word, we can, thanks to the diaries, chart the evolution of this tripolar microcosm, observing the deterioration of environmental conditions and the gradual disintegration of a social system, as well as the dire impact that the extreme situation had on the deportees' way of life. Without a doubt, their Nerses and Krikor Bogharian's diaries bear first and foremost on what they saw and experienced in the 3 years and more of their exile, the events that took place in their field of vision. The interpretations they offer also surely depend on their personal worldviews and their mood on the day a given diary entry was made. So phenomena of this sort, however, are not peculiar to diaries or the genre of self-narration in general. Rather, in our view, a subjective factor is at work in all forms of textual expression, whether letter memoir, or a state official's political report. Consequently, what is essential is not the primary source itself, but the methodology of the scholar utilizing it, that is, the extent of his or her familiarity with the subject under investigation and skill at locating it in a broader context. When the second desideratum is lacking, it seems to me the scholarly work loses its authenticity and fails in its attempt to reconstitute an accurate picture of the past. And in this perspective, moreover, I see no difference between the intellectual productions of a scholar who consults thousands of documents in a state archive and another who bases his entire work on an eyewitness account by a single individual. In the case to hand, making diarists into main protagonists is an essential requirement flowing from the need to make the narrative as authentic as possible. For a subject of this kind, a deportee's insider's perspective is likewise indispensable, since it enables us to understand and study the influences at work in a given social structure, the individual strategies deployed in it, and many other details of the rapid transformation of a human life environment. And throughout our study, throughout my study, it will be crucially important to set the level of microhistorical observation in relation to that of the wider context. Properly understood, the Armenians' environment in Hama Salamiyya was never an isolated world. Its history was intimately bound up with the situation of Armenian deportees in other towns and villages in Bilad al-Sham region. And of course, each locality had its peculiarities and distinct social system. These disparities had to do not only with the varying conditions in the villages and towns of Bilad al-Sham and their indigenous populations, but also with the differences between the groups of Armenian deportees that had settled in them. Thus, a majority of those exiled in the agricultural district of Salamiyya were urban Armenians from Aintab, whereas the big commercial city of Damascus in the same time, although it too saw the arrival of a large numbers of urban deportees from Cilicia, was also settled by substantial numbers of exiles from rural western Anatolia. And under such circumstances, local characteristics combined with the Armenian exiles' origin and character to create singular situations that heightened the disparities between the various places of exile in Bilad al-Sham. And naturally, this diversity contributed to shaping the deportees' strategies of survival. Thus, Armenians in Damascus could sometimes exercise a trade or open a small business to earn a living. And in contrast, large numbers of Armenians from Aintab were forced to leave Salamiyya, which was basically an overgrown village, for the nearby town of Hama, that was in 1917, where they expected to find openings for people working in their trade, weaving. So all these phenomena underscore the importance of the local history of every one of the Armenians' places of exile. Thus, there is no gainsaying the significance of microhistorical study of the population centers in which the Armenian deportees found themselves, including Damascus, Amman, Homs, Jarash, Rayak, Salt, Aleppo, Oran, and many others. Such study will surely shed new light on the extreme conditions that the Armenians encountered in this region in general. Yet, major disparities of this kind notwithstanding, it seems likely that the deportees faced the same basic problems no matter where they found themselves in Bilad al-Sham. Epidemics, a steadily worsening economic crisis, the fear that they would be displaced again, steadily increasing food prices, the draft. These problems formed a whole. They appeared simultaneously throughout Bilad al-Sham with virtually the same intensity and evolved along the same lines. This means that there was a certain homogeneity in these environments in Bilad al-Sham in which Armenian deportees were struggling to survive, and that the essential difference resided in the means adopted to overcome the dangers that all faced. Both Krikor Bogharians and their Nerses diaries have been published. Both diaries were released in Beirut, Bogharians in 1973, their Nerses in 1991. Bogharians' diary comprises a chapter in a general work entitled Tsehasban Turke, Vegayuchunner Kahvat Rashkov Pergevazneru Zeluisneren, the genocidal Turk, eyewitness accounts called from the accounts of people who were miraculously saved. And this chapter is 81 pages long, and their Nerses diary was edited by Toros Toranian. It begins in 1909 and is carried down to 1933 with interruptions. In all, the diary contains, the diary of their Nerses contains 393 pages. The entries for the 3 years from the deportation to the liberation take up 95 pages. My efforts to obtain the manuscript of Bogharian's diary were unsuccessful, but I had better luck in their Nerses case. Thus, we know that the diarist, their Nerses, who was settled in Aleppo in the early 1920s, continued to live there until he was murdered in 1934. After his death, one of the priest's sons, Kevork Nersoyan, took it upon himself to have the diary recopied with the obvious intention of publishing it. And this task was accomplished by Father Kalust Ekmekjian, also from Aleppo, who prepared a typed copy of as much of the manuscript of the diary as was contained in the notebooks put at his disposal. And thanks to my friend Miram Minassian's efforts, he's from Aleppo, now living in Yerevan, and what I have at my disposal now, besides the published text, is thus the typed variant of their Nerses diary, comprising a total of 800 pages. The entries for the period running from the deportation to liberation by themselves comprise 84 pages. It is most fortunate that I have this variant, for these are major discrepancies between the typed and the published version of the text. The editor of the published book evidently excised many entries about the illnesses and especially epidemic diseases that befell their Nerses family, as well as scenes in which the sick receive care. Also occasionally excised are evocations of the degradation of the deportees that the deportees underwent under the extreme conditions. And this is unfortunate because information of this kind sometimes holds the key to understanding their Nerses' day-to-day life, the conditions of his and his family's existence, and their struggle for survival. It should be pointed out here that in conducting the research for the present study, I was able to consult, besides their Nerses and Bogharian's diaries, other writings by the two men that shed further light on the deportees' environment in the Salamiyya, Hama area. These writings are personal testimonials, such as letters written during the years of deportation or thereafter, autobiographical notes written thereafter, and essays and books that in the aggregate help us arrive at a better understanding of our two diarists, their personalities and their times. In Bogharian's case, it proved possible to obtain, in addition to his many published articles and books, some of his personal papers housed in the archives of Beirut's Haigazian University. The portion of their Nerses Nachlas that may be characterized as personal testimonial consists rather in the untold letters he wrote, many of which it proved possible to find in the archives of the Catholicosat of Cilicia and Antillas, or in the Central Archive of the HBU in Cairo. Also important to my work was material available in the archives of the Armenian Prelacy of Aleppo, which housed for the period of the deportation the minutes and account books of Armenian community institutions. Although these documents rarely bear directly on the Hama Salamiyya area, they nevertheless proved to be precious primary sources for understanding the fundamental problems that the deported Armenians of Bilad al-Sham faced, for retracing the complicated operations required in order to provide assistance to the traumatized people there. In the final analysis, utilization of all these documents serve the same ultimate purpose. They are means to understanding the strategies of survival developed by the deportees in the Hama Salamiyya area, the many obstacles in their path, and their daily battle to obtain food and stay alive. At the same time, researching the present study showed just how badly neglected a genre the diary has been in the study of the Armenian genocide. Deportees who kept diaries are far from rare. Many others followed their Nerses and Bogharian's example. Among these diaries, we find in particular priests. I don't have a special explanation for that, but also well-read young people like Bogharian and still others who had only an elementary education. In a word, all indications are that keeping a diary during the catastrophe was a widespread practice, and that Armenians from nearly every social stratum did so. The essential question, however, is the way these diaries were ultimately utilized. Many found it inappropriate to publish their experience as survivors in diary form. Instead, they reworked their diaries and transformed them into autobiography. As a result, to borrow Philippe Legendre and Catherine Bogart's expression, their writing lost its essential feature, namely the authenticity of the moment. The field of Armenian genocide studies includes many other texts of personal testimony that have been subsequently edited and prepared for publication by not their authors, but others. Editors have often seen fit, in Krikor Bogharian's phrase, to make these texts acceptable, to upgrade them by rewriting them, given that their authors were not writers, historians, or college graduates. All this, of course, testifies to a lack of awareness of the inherent value of diaries. I am, however, convinced that in some circumstances, this underestimation of diaries also stems from a concern that might be defined as an extreme sense of shame or self-accusation. Similarly, an attentive reading of their Nerses or Krikor Bogharian's diaries justifies the supposition that the two of them recorded episodes, personal or not, or described moral compromises made for the sake of survival, which were regarded as unacceptable and blameworthy from the standpoint of the reconstructed Armenian historiography of the post-war period, or more generally, when measured against the social norms prevailing in their community. These are diaries whose authors, together with some members of their immediate families, were genocide survivors. It is very probable that the fact that they had to give account to post-war Armenian society weighed quite heavily on these individuals and their descendants. They consequently felt a pressing need to revise their or their relatives' work, insert explanations, bring the text into line with the spirit of the time, publish only excerpts, or going still further, simply leave them unpublished, with the result that with the passage of time, entire diaries have been lost. There exists, moreover, another factor that also has to do with the domestic Armenian climate in the post-war period. The fact is that the genocide was transformed into a tale about martyrs and heroes. It was clear that the martyrs were the countless victims who had been led off to slaughter, while the heroes were those who leveled rifles at their executioners, fought arms in hand, and fell on the field of unequal battle. However, as Yehuda Bauer rightly notes about the Jewish Holocaust, there is no justification for turning Holocaust history into hagiography of the victims. Bauer continues, it is wrong to demand in retrospect that these tortured individuals and communities should have behaved as mythical heroes. So time would show that the process of Armenian national reconstruction would succeed in expunging the face of Bilad al-Sham from the Armenians' collective memory. This phase was the parenthesis where deportees have made compromises in order to survive. The highlight of this phase is the collective conversion of the deported Armenians to Islam. Subsequently, for decades on end, Armenian memories and historians very rarely reflected on this phenomenon or subjected it to serious examination. It is as if description or narration of the catastrophe could not acknowledge the existence of a collective stain of this kind. In fact, in Armenian historiography or Armenian culture in general, the Armenian genocide takes the form of an episode in which an entire people was martyred. The image of the martyr nation has been sanctified. The victims have been subjected to a metamorphosis that has made them objects of admiration and even veneration. And in this process of sanitization, the victims of the crime, both those who were killed and those who survived, have been transformed into paragons of innocence and purity. In a monolithic presentation of this sort, one important facet of the catastrophe is naturally overlooked: the struggle against mass violence by all available means and the natural human tendency to try to survive at any price. Doubtless, many were inclined to see a kind of desecration in the sudden appearance in this picture studded with powerful symbols of the episode of collective Islamization. In their eyes, it could perhaps have tarnished the image of the hallowed martyr and sowed confusion in officialized discourse. The upshot of this situation was that people began collectively to forget the event that occurred under the empire of evil. This is a term used by Father Nerses himself in his diary. And the same priest from Aintab, during his deportation years, pronounced religious and national anathema on his compatriots for their religious conversion. Apostasy and moral degradation were for him red lines beyond which lay the greatest of the disasters that could befall a human being. The priest from Aintab, Father Nerses, witnessed this tragedy and the crossing of the red line. The deported Armenians had, however, been liberated in 1918. The conditions of their lives had been transformed. And the group of tens of thousands of survivors of Bilad al-Sham had collectively returned to the national community and national church. The doors were open to them, and Father Nerses too, despite his abiding bitterness, probably found himself with no choice but to accept them and live and work with them. So in an atmosphere of this kind, the survivors' self-narration about their day-to-day struggles, the concessions they made for the sake of staying alive, and their departures from their own moral standards may at first glance seem to have nothing heroic about it, and to be at a far remove from scenes of massacres and armed resistance. The sad thing is that this fact has helped shape these decisions about whether to make diaries and more generally personal testimonials available to the public. So some words about the content of the book, the forthcoming book. So my work is divided into two sections. The first familiarizes the reader with the environment in which the Nerses and Krikor Bogharian survived the Armenian genocide. Here I make the acquaintance of the two diaries, and by way of an examination of their diaries of crucial problems confronting the deported Armenian natives of Aintab. In the first months, from May 1915 onwards, living conditions were relatively clement in the Hama Salamiyya region to which these people had been deported. Members of one and the same family had generally been deported together, and many of the deportees from Aintab lived concentrated in these two localities. What were the vital advantages of such a mode of life? So I take a close look at each of the three links in the chain: money, food, connections. For these Armenian struggles for survival was carried out in a context defined by that chain. Demonstrably, all these links in it represented means of survival. Each was closely bound to the other, and destruction of any one of them could call the whole process of adaptation and survival to a halt, with fatal consequences for the exiles. Under the conditions that obtained in the Hama Salamiyya region, as appears when we take the Nerses and Krikor Bogharians' own families as examples, all three links were progressively weakened as time went on, making the effort required for survival more onerous. This situation harbored the obvious threat of an irreversible decline. That threat hung over the heads of every last exile in the region, their Nerses and Krikor Bogharian included. In the second section of the book, I observed the undoing of the structure of familial or communal or compatriotic self-help. Our diaries themselves chronicle the failure of the efforts to ensure survival and the gradual extension and reinforcement of death's empire over the deportees' environment in Hama Salamiyya. Their Nerses in particular writes of the period beyond this stage, more precisely the period that began in 1917, and thus become a witness to moral decline. As a result of hunger and epidemic diseases, the death rate now reached merciless levels, while the deportees faced with this state of affairs had become, generally speaking, weak, spent creatures. Their Nerses often says of the deportees at this stage that they had become animals. This means that the whole social structure had collapsed and that normal human relations had disappeared under their ruins. The deportees were now ready to make all sorts of compromises for the sake of surviving, to engage in behavior that they would have abhorred under normal conditions. Their Nerses' position in the face of all this is extremely interesting. Could the priest who so sharply criticized those around him himself remain immune to the atmosphere created by the ruin of standing customs and practices and maintain his social and religious conception of things intact? So some portions of my forthcoming book will be read tonight by Mark. So these are some portions which are taken from the second part of the work. In other words, the period where these social and economic conditions in Hama Salamiyya are worsened, means of subsisting and means of survival were further restricted, and their Nerses described this situation as being the moral decline of the Armenian deportees, the time of their bestialization for many of them.
So I will read these couple of extracts before Vahe comes back up to answer questions. The first comes from the section entitled "The Diarist as Witness to Catastrophe: Depictions of the Deportees' Moral Decline." And this deals with the diary of Der Nerses. The other Armenian eyewitness accounts of the genocide known to us generally confine themselves either to a chronological narration of events or to general descriptions of scenes. Absent from them are penetrating views of the inner recesses of the deportees' lives, sociological or philosophical commentary, or profound analyses. For this paragon of a conscientious priest, Der Nerses also had close contact with all the strata of the community of deportees. He was an eyewitness to what was happening on the ground, who exhorted and encouraged his flock and did what he could to halt their accelerating demoralization. As a result, his daily jottings reflect the reactions of a despondent priest who directly experienced that decline and tried to understand and analyze the deportees' unusual mode of life, while simultaneously condemning their indifference and utter passivity, as well as their renunciation of social and Christian values. From this point on, Der Nerses became the author of an eyewitness account of moral decline. One of the recurring images in the priest's diary is that of the deportees' bestialization. In other words, the collapse of a whole social structure. Quote, In the case of many people, staying alive is not life, but rather just a matter of breathing. Already a number of poor, helpless people are living the lives of animals, and unfeeling animals at that. They have forgotten everything. I would never have imagined how low misery can make a human being sink, unquote. This remark comes from an entry made in December 1917, after Nerses moved to Hama with his family, where he was trying to earn a living making manusa, in the face of very serious problems. Among many of the people around him, he had already detected an exhaustion and an indifference that were in the process of gaining the upper hand. Quote, now all that people mean by living is eating and breathing. Life's moral demands and spiritual needs have been left completely to one side. The mind no longer functions or rules, noble sentiments have been benumbed, and people act only on instinct, their one thought being to keep breathing a little longer. Unquote. Conspicuous scenes of decline were visible on the ground. The number of deaths was gradually increasing, and unburied Armenian bodies could be seen in Hama's streets. Quote, very early every morning, the corpses of deported Armenian orphans of both sexes who have been left without anyone to care for them and had been sleeping out in the open are gathered up in Cilicia, big bath towels, or arabas, carts, and transported from the city to give yet another portion to the soil that is so hungry for Armenian bodies. There they are dumped in ditches like heaps of refuse, unquote. Beside physical decline, the sight of dead Armenians who had been left without protectors was also for Nerses one of the most shocking signs of demoralization. In his capacity as priest, he knew a great deal about the domestic lives of the families around him and of the tragedies that were taking place in them. Quote, the father of a family, all of whose members are sick, just died, he writes, and they only just barely managed to bury him 4 days later. In the course of the week, the members of a family of 4 or 5 starved to death. It was 2 days before people noticed the corpses. They were loaded onto belediye tamburs, small carts belonging to the municipality, and deposited outside the city limits, unquote. For Nerses, such things were unbearable. Giving the dead a decent Christian burial was a priority in his eyes. With this in mind, he succeeded in January 1918 in convening a meeting of Aintab notables at which he convinced them to raise the small sums required to finance burials for the dead. Later, he would meet with Hama's Merkez Kumandan, garrison commander, Osman Bey, to discuss the same problem. Osman Bey promised to see to it that funds from the state budget were allocated for burials. It was around the same time that the priest from Aintab visited the caves near Hama, located on the heights near the banks of the Orontes River. Although they faced the sun, dirt and humidity made them insalubrious and uninhabitable. Most important, the caves had become shelters for impoverished Armenian deportees. In every one of them, dozens of families were living piled on one another. Nerses was manifestly much affected by the sight. Quote, I was confronted with a dreadful, wrenching condition, he writes. Families of 8 to 10 members lie there, squeezed together, withered, dejected. Large numbers of once strapping young men are so faint with hunger that they lie stretched out on the ground, ignoring even those who call out to them. Whenever they catch sight of someone, those who stall have breath left in them to cry out, give bread, give us bread. The priest, however, could not satisfy these demands. He had come here to see about burying the dead, and that was the only way he could help these poor people. Thus, the cave's inhabitants were disappointed, for all they wanted was food. There was even one man among them who said he preferred that he and others like him should serve as feed for dogs after they died. Nerses found the incident terrifying. He wrote in his diary, quote, ah, what a terrible condition it has become natural for that most sensitive of all creatures, man, to picture the body of his loved ones as food for the ravenous beasts that feed on corpses. He can bear that. It is as if, in these lines, Nerses' religious and human feelings had become one. This indifference to the dead is for him a supreme embodiment of moral degradation and the utter defeat of the struggle for survival. It is on this occasion that he produces one of the most impressive passages in his diary. Quote, are there still deeper levels of misery? How deep can one descend? We go one step further down every day. We think that we've taken the last step, but then we see that there must be still deeper depths. Will we ever find the bottom of these abysses without end and start to climb back up out of them? And the second passage is from the section entitled Christianity, Second Skin or Road, the Deported Armenians' Islamization in Bilad al-Sham. In the extreme conditions that prevailed in Bilad al-Sham, one of the most shocking dimensions of the Hobbesian social contract was without a doubt the deportees' collective Islamization. This was the event that more than any other shows how abnormal the deportees' environment had become. The endangered, impoverished, and in many respects now unrecognizable Armenians were summoned to make a concession fraught with consequences. There are essentially no individual studies of the subject, and it must also be said that in Armenian eyewitness accounts, Islamization is rarely mentioned. Generally speaking, the authors of such accounts only make brief allusions to collective conversions, yet there are a handful of exceptions, authors who have deemed this theme deserving of more detailed and more comprehensive description and analysis. Nerses and Bogharian are both examples. There is a great deal of information on the subject in both men's diaries. Bogharian, in his turn, has fairly detailed descriptions of the conversion process in Salamiyya. This is hardly surprising since he had been named to the post of clerk in the conversion office. According to the young diarist, there were two ways of accepting Islam. In the first, the head of a family would appear personally before the local Qadi, and on behalf of the family would recite the Shahada, the Islamic credo. Then he would submit the new Islamic names he and the other members of his family had chosen for themselves. The second way of converting was much simpler and involved less public display. The head of a household would present himself in the conversion office with a list of the old names, and beside them the new Islamic names of all the family members. The clerks in the conversion office would copy these names into a single general register, thus making the family's Islamization official. The Bogharians opted for the second method. Since the head of the family had already been banished, Krikor Bogharian, as the oldest child in the house, presented himself in person at the conversion office, where he was given the name Shihab, while his mother was renamed Maryam. However true the point of these examples is, it is a safe assumption that in the long term, the apostate Armenians and their descendants would have become accustomed to the new state of things and would have been gradually assimilated into local Muslim society. Nerses, who was an embittered and at the same time perspicacious eyewitness to the conversion phenomenon, remarks in one of the entries in his diary, quote, "If, God forbid, this state of affairs should persist for even a few years, the religious feeling, that is Christian religious feeling, that has already grown faint will simply die." Unquote. Basically, for the apostate Armenians, the real problem was surviving to the end of the war, being allowed to live under normal conditions and returning to their former social and religious situation. On the other hand, they were very well aware that, as in other questions as well, what was determinant in the last instance in the case of conversion was the time factor, and that sooner or later the harsh consequences of their change of religion would make themselves felt. It is indeed true that in the environment of Bilad al-Sham, conversion must be regarded from the standpoint of the art of survival. At the same time, however, the fact is that the longer the extreme conditions weighing down on the deportees lasted, the worse their conditions could become, and that Islamization could then have undesirable results. Islamized Armenian families with young daughters were especially worried. For them, if conversion was on the one hand a victory gained against the time factor, it was on the other a step fraught with risks that could deal their conceptions of what was socially proper a heavy blow. Quote, "The first fruits of our conversion to Islam have begun to appear," Bogharian writes in this connection on September 1st, 1916. "In the villages, some Muslim young men have sought to marry Armenian girls now that they are of the same faith. Nikah, Muslim marriage between Armenian women I seem to have the wrong page that follows that. Okay, well, I'll have to leave it there because I don't know,
The other passage that
maybe Vahe can fill in the blanks.
yeah, I think it was clear that in some villages, young Armenian were forced to marry Muslims who consider that now that they are converted, so it is possible to marry them. And this was very one of the fears that the deportees had expected, and it was becoming a reality.
Sorry about that. Well, let us open the floor then for questions. Please.
I've got a question. the people in Lebanon and Syria, were they born there or were they originally from Turkey?
You mean the people now, or? I'm also from Lebanon. I was born in Lebanon.
In what time period do you mean?
Yeah, you mean the persons who came from the Ottoman Empire? Yeah, they are also the sons of the deportees. The generation was living now in Lebanon and Syria, but they came, the majority
Well,
of them
what sort of community in numbers of Armenians was there in Lebanon and Syria before the genocide?
Okay, now it's clear. There was a big community in Aleppo. Some 10,000 Armenians lived in Aleppo. But in other towns in Syria, there was a very little community in Damascus. And in Lebanon, Beirut, no, there was only a group of students who were living there as in the American University or the French University, and the majority of them were so students in Beirut. But there was not a real community life at that time in the Ottoman period in Lebanon.
In their memoirs, are there any references to are the refugees or from Aintab, or were also from refugees who passed through Aintab? Is there any timing and qualifications of the people where they were actually from?
Yeah, actually, the Nerses and even Bogharian in their diaries, they mention the passage of deportees from the town who were coming from the north.
So, did you get a sense from? Did you get a sense from going through all the pages of these two specific diaries of the impetus of what made them keep the diaries? I mean, what was the? Did you get a sense of what was it in those dire circumstances? How were they? Why? I mean.
Do they ever address it directly?
Yeah, why are they writing it down?
There is different concept for that. For every person, there is different vision for why they are writing diaries. In the case, for example, of the Nerses, his diary begins in 1909. That means this is not only for witnessing an event or a catastrophe. So maybe it was only something like part of his ordinary life to keep a diary. And many other persons, I think, at that time it was, there is keeping diaries becoming a very, very modern research tema, and from the 19th century onwards, keeping diary in Europa, for example, it was very an ordinary thing, and Armenians also in many cases they follow this kind of practice, and they keep diaries even before the genocide. I mean, this is not only to be a testimony of a catastrophe. But in the case of Bogharian, I think he already began in 1915 to write his diary, and I have my own explanation for that. I think that he was cut from the school that he very liked his school in Aintab, and he was very attached to his school and his days and his friends and his teachers, and he was really a person cut with that education, and he looked for alternatives to make life easier in deportation, and one of that alternatives was keeping a diary and writing, and even he copied books, entire books. He translated books from Turkish into Armenian, or from English into Armenian. So he kept this kind of intellectual life very active.
Are there are there like major gaps sometimes in them, you know, in the days that he was keeping the diaries?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
For example, in the case of Father Nerses, this is a detail that I didn't mention here because we have not time for that. All the priests is kahana, yeah? All the priests were exiled in just before this massive conversion into Islam. So the Turkish authorities, the Ottoman authorities, gathered all the priests and pastors, Protestant Armenian pastors from all towns and villages, and they forced to exile into this little town, Tafila. And so all were there, and this for their necessity, this was a second exile after a second deportation, and this was very heavily felt by himself, and this was his maybe in his jottings of that period, his the darkest moments of his entire deportee life. And some segments of that diary is empty, so there is no entries at that time, or very few.
Dr. Smani?
This sad story of deportation sounds like a continuation of the genocide. And have you any idea if there were 100 people deported, how many died, how many were converted to Islam, and how many survived? Out of the 100?
No, I don't have numbers. But we are talking about this second line of deportation. So I'm not the persons who were deported to Bilad al-Sham, not to the desert, where massacres took place. But in these places, the situation was different. There was no massacres, but there was other aspects of life which were leading